Hello, friends. Welcome to World Astrology Report with me, your host, Dan Waits. What we're going to be doing on this show is trying to figure out what the hell is going on in this crazy world of ours using astrology. The branch of astrology that we're going to be doing is called mundane astrology, but that's not a very good name for what we're doing because mundane means boring. We're going to be looking at the most interesting things that are happening in the world today. We're also going to be looking at some of the most interesting things that happened in the past. We're going to be looking at history, and we're going to be looking at how planetary cycles unfold in order to make predictions about the future. Now, if that sounds interesting to you, please like and subscribe to the channel now and join me for future episodes. Now, I want to start World Astrology Report with a bold claim. And my claim is that the astrological revival is only just beginning. And that's what I'm going to make the case for in this video. I have three major reasons why, and I'm going to explain them to you one by one. Now, what I'm going to say in this video is based on an article I wrote a few weeks ago. It was called Sorry Skeptics, The Future is Astrological. And you can find a link to that article in the description below. But I started that article by poking a bit of fun at Neil deGrasse Tyson. Now, I don't really have anything against Neil deGrasse Tyson, but he does like to take pot shots at astrologers. So he's got to expect that sometimes astrologers are going to take pot shots at him. You live by the sword, you die by the sword. Sorry, Neil. And I have some bad news for Neil and for the skeptic community. And the bad news is this: astrology is not going anywhere, in my opinion. I think that planetary cycles show that astrology is only going to grow and boom over the coming decades and centuries. Now, astrology is really booming right now, and a lot of astrologers have wondered if that has something to do with the presence of Neptune in Pisces. And this is certainly something that Chris Brennan and Austin Coppock and his guests have talked about on the Astrology podcast. And I think the idea has a lot of merit. The planet Neptune shows where our collective imagination is directed towards. And in Pisces, it's directed towards mystical matters and to the idea that everything is connected and that boundaries are not real. And therefore, in the last few years, we've seen a boom in astrology, as well as adjacent topics like magic and other forms of divination, such as tarot, as well as conspiracy theories like flat Earth and QAnon, and so on. But what's going to happen in 2025 when Neptune leaves Pisces for the Martial territory of Aries? Does that mean that the boom in astrology and those other topics is going to fade away? Some of them may be, but I think astrology is going to continue to go from strength to strength. And now I'm going to get into my reasons why. Number one, the age of air. Now, if you don't know what the age of air is, I've got you. I've written an article about that, and you can find it again in the description below. But to understand what I mean when I say the age of air, you need to understand a very old theory of history that astrologers developed in the golden age of Baghdad in the 8th and 9th centuries. Now, this theory was developed by great astrologers such as Masha Allah and Abu Mashar. And what they wanted to do was find a way to understand how history worked. And they did this using the great conjunctions. The great conjunctions were conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn. And every 20 years, these two planets conjoin. Now, the interesting thing about that is that the geometry of the zodiac and the solar system means that these conjunctions happen in signs of the same element for roughly 200 years, and then they change element. So you get 200 years of fire conjunctions, then 200 years of earth, then 200 years of air, and then 200 years of water, and then the cycle repeats. So what we have is an 800-year cycle. Now, the astrologers who developed this theory used it to predict the changing of dynasties and leaders. They used it to predict the appearance of prophets as well as calamities. Now, the interesting thing is that we've just passed through an age of Earth. And what was Earth associated with? Well, it was associated with the tangible, with the material, with things like money and land. And if we think back to what happened in the 19th and 20th centuries, well, we saw the Industrial Revolution. We saw the triumph of capitalism. We saw things like colonialism. We saw the whole world being divided into parcels of land called nation states. What we also saw is the adoption of a materialist metaphysics, where essentially the world was held to just consist of stuff, and the spiritual dimensions of life were denied. I think you can probably agree that Earth quite well characterizes that period. Now, I previously said that these elemental ages are sequences of 200 years, but actually that's a bit of a simplification of what really happens, because due to retrograde motion, there's actually a bit of a back and forth between elements at the ends of these ages. So I'll give you an example. In 1980, we had the first air conjunction in the sign of Libra, but then in 2000, we moved back to Earth with a conjunction in Taurus. Then in 2020, we had a conjunction in Aquarius, and now it's going to be air conjunctions all the way. So we're really in the age of air. But that period of 1980 to 2020 was an interesting one. It was a kind of transitional period in which both air and earth were operative. Now, the obvious question now is, well, what is air associated with? Air is associated with things like connection and the intellect. It's quite remarkable that what happened in that first air period of 1980 to 2000 is the invention of the World Wide Web, an information technology that connects everyone together. Now, the question is, what does an age of air have to do with astrology? Now, first of all, let's take a look at the rulerships of the different signs in the air triplicity. We have Gemini, ruled by Mercury. We have Libra, ruled by Venus, in which Saturn is exalted. And we have Aquarius, traditionally ruled by Saturn. Now, we also have what's called triplicity rulers, which were outlined in texts written by a Hellenistic astrologer named Dorotheus. Now, each of the triplicities was assigned 3 planets as additional rulers, and the air triplicity rulers were Saturn, Mercury, and Jupiter. Now, if we look at all these rulers, we see a little pattern occurring, which is that Saturn and Mercury are very strong amongst all these rulerships. Now, that's interesting because Mercury is the traditional ruler of astrology. Mercury is the planet of hermeneutics, the planet of communication, the messenger of the gods. And then Saturn is connected with the old, and Saturn is connected with ancient wisdom. So these 2 factors alone suggest that astrology and other forms of divination, particularly ancient forms, are likely to be revived in ages of air. Now, we've looked at the symbolic, but the other way we can look at ages of air is to look historically at what happened in previous ages of air. Now, if we look back to the age of air of the classical period, roughly 462 BCE to 164 BCE, well, this was the period where Alexander of Macedon, or Alexander the Great as he was known, forged a huge Greek-speaking empire around the Mediterranean and the Middle East. And what happened in the crucible of this empire was that old ideas and the astrology developed by the Babylonians and the Egyptians was fused together with Greek religious ideas to create Hellenistic astrology. So this age of air was a really important period in the history of astrology. Now, the point here isn't to give credit to the Greeks for taking the ideas of conquered peoples, but merely to note that during this age of air, these ideas were brought together and were able to spread widely through this empire. Now we're going to move to the age of air of the medieval period. And once again, we see a process of revival of ancient wisdom. Now, what happened during this period is that during the preceding age of Earth, trade links had been forged with the neighboring Islamic civilization. Now, that Islamic civilization had inherited and developed a lot of ancient wisdom, including the wisdom of astrology. During this age of air, that information started to flow back into Europe, and it led to an astrological renaissance. This is the period, for example, of the astrologer Guido Bonatti, who became very famous. He was astrological advisor to the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, and he was famous enough that Dante sent him to hell in the Divine Comedy, which just goes to show how popular probably astrologers and how well-known Bonatti was at that time. So we're starting to see a theme here of ancient wisdom being revived in ages of air. Now let's look at our current age of air. Now, as I explained before, it began in 1980. Now, we see something quite interesting there because the first US president of that age of air, Ronald Reagan, was advised by an astrologer, Joan Quigley. Now, this is simply a fact. You can read Joan Quigley's book, What Does Joan Say? It's pretty much undeniable, even though the Reagan administration tried to deny it and in somewhat sexist fashion pin it all on Nancy Reagan, but don't believe that. There's no doubt whatsoever that Reagan was being advised by an astrologer. It's very well attested. Now, that's kind of interesting. The first US president of the Age of Air is advised by an astrologer. That is what we call an omen. Now, if we look again to that period, 1980 to 2000, that first air period, we also see something else interesting. We see the revival of traditional astrology. Particularly in 1993, we see the beginning of Project Hindsight. What was Project Hindsight? Well, three famous astrologers, Robert Zoller, Robert Schmidt, and Robert Hand, launched a project to translate ancient texts and bring back ancient wisdom into the tradition. So they started translating ancient Hellenistic texts that had never been translated into English before. And what the result was the revival of traditional astrology that we're seeing now, and a return of a lot of ancient wisdom that had laid dormant for a long time. So I think it's pretty clear that astrology is already showing signs of strength in our age of air. So that's my first reason for thinking that the astrological revival is just beginning, but I have two more. Now, to understand my next two examples, you need to understand a really important principle of how planetary cycles work. And it's pretty simple. It's just this: events that take place at a conjunction show you what the whole cycle promises. Now, to understand this, I'm going to give you an example. For example, the Saturn-Pluto cycle. Now, Saturn-Pluto conjunctions are associated with some really tough stuff in history. We actually just had a Saturn-Pluto conjunction in 2020 on January 12th, right when COVID was getting going, but that's another story. We're going to look back to the Saturn-Pluto conjunctions of 1982 in Libra. Now, what was going on around this time? Well, obviously a lot of things, but something that was happening of interest is that we saw the first wave of modern suicide bombings around this time. Now, these bombings happened in Lebanon, and they were against US interests. And as a result of these attacks, the US left that country. Now, this was noticed by a certain Osama bin Laden, who thought it showed that the United States was a paper tiger. This is what he said. And he thought that it showed that the US could be influenced by these kind of attacks. Now, what happened in this cycle? Well, in 2001, Saturn and Pluto opposed each other. And that year, we had the September the 11th attacks. So we can see how what happened through that cycle was promised at the conjunction. So now we get to my second reason for why I think the astrological revival is only just beginning. And that's the Uranus-Neptune conjunction of 1993. Now, this conjunction is pretty interesting. It coincided with the birth of the World Wide Web. But that year, 1993, should ring a bell because we've already mentioned it. 1993 was the year that Project Hindsight was initiated. So we saw a revival of traditional astrology happening right at this conjunction. Now, the astrologer Chris Brennan has pointed out on a number of occasions that when you get these Uranus-Neptune conjunctions, you see astrological revivals. Now, what's interesting to me is that we have this revival happening right at the conjunction. And I think what that tells us is something about what the Uranus-Neptune cycle promises. The Uranus-Neptune cycle lasts 170 years. And I think the fact that we saw this revival right at the conjunction tells us that that's going to play a role in the unfolding of this cycle. Now, Neptune is currently in Pisces and Uranus is currently in Taurus. So they're in sextile by sign. But between 2025 and 2027, that sextile is going to start going exact. And I think that we're going to see a lot more from the revival of Hellenistic astrology and traditional astrology in general through that period. So now we've reached my third and final reason why I think the astrological revival is really only just beginning. And for this one, we need to look at another planetary cycle, the Pluto-Neptune cycle. Now, this cycle is 492 years long. And the last time Pluto and Neptune conjoined was in 1891 and 1892. So we're currently about 130 years into one of these cycles. Now, the Pluto-Neptune cycle has a lot to do with transformations of consciousness and belief, of really deep and profound changes to how we organize our societies. So once again, what we should do is look at what was going on in the late 19th century and early 20th century, the period when the Pluto-Neptune conjunction I'm talking about was in orb, because that will tell us a lot about what's going to unfold through this 492-year cycle that we're currently in. Now, the late 19th century was a really interesting period. It was a period of incredible technological advancement, but it was also a period of occult revival. In the late 19th century, 1875, we saw the founding of Theosophy by the Russian mystic Helena Blavatsky. And what Theosophy did is it brought ideas from East and West together, ideas from Western esotericism together with ideas from Hinduism and Buddhism, and created this new religion. Now, one theosophist was a man who called himself Alan Leo. And Alan Leo has since been referred to as the father of modern astrology. Now, Alan Leo did a lot to popularize astrology. His astrology was very influenced by the theosophists, who put a lot of emphasis on ideas of spiritual evolution. But regardless of the details of what you think of Alan Leo's astrology, the point is that modern astrology was born in this period when the Pluto-Neptune conjunction was in orb. So what does that tell us? Well, if we use our principle that we've gone back to again and again, it tells us that what this full 492-year cycle promises is a revival of astrology. Now, Pluto and Neptune are currently within 6 degrees of a sextile aspect, and they're making a really long sextile because they move roughly at the same speed at the moment. They've been in this 6 degrees of sextile since about 1945, and they're going to remain so until the 2030s. Now, over the coming years, they're going to start getting closer to an exact sextile again. And between 2026 and 2032, that sextile is going to start perfecting again. So what I think we'll see is an intensification of the things that were signified by that Pluto-Neptune conjunction in the late 19th century. So I think we're again going to see a re-intensification of the revival of astrology. In other words, I don't think the revival of astrology is going anywhere, and my reasons are these planetary cycles. So that's it for this video. Thanks so much for watching. If you did like it, please do like and subscribe, and please also share it with anybody else who you think might be interested in what I'm doing. I'm going to be putting out regular videos, and I'd really like to build a community of people who are interested in this way of looking at the world. Thanks very much.